Hello and welcome to this TRT World special town hall from United Nations headquarters in New York. I'm Jafar Hassan.
And I'm Amanda Walker.
We are at the heart of action at this high-stakes United Nations General Assembly, which, according to the American president, comes at an inflection point.
Yeah, world leaders have gathered here to tackle a whirl of conflicts and crises that are dominating an increasingly fragmented global landscape. Top of the agenda is the UN's response to fears of an all-out war in the Middle East.
We'll examine the United Nations' role in preventing escalation in Lebanon and ongoing attacks in Gaza. And we'll also look at what role can Turkey play in addressing challenges facing the region.
With wars also in Ukraine and Sudan, we are living through a really challenging moment in world affairs. Luckily, we have a distinguished panel to help us make some sense of it. Let me introduce them to you. So we have Kadir Ustun, who is the Executive Director at the Setter Foundation in Washington, D.C.
We also have William Lawrence, former U.S. diplomat and professor at American University.
And Omar Rahman, fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. But William, I'd like to start with you. So President Biden, who will be passing through here in a moment, said in his last UN address as US president that we're at an inflection point. Do you agree with that, and can you expand on that idea?
Sure. We're always at an inflection point. I mean, that's every political campaign and every historical moment when we're talking about the globe. But I think what he meant is, the issues that he cares about are at tipping points, and one of them is democracy. I mean, the U.S. hasn't done a fantastic job on promotion of international democracy, but it has done some things, including the 2 summits and promoting democracy in certain parts of the world. And of course, he's at an inflection point with his own career. I mean, this is his last UN speech. He's just stepped down and he's no longer the candidate for the Democrats. And I found the speech in many ways a campaign speech. And one of the themes of the speech that is both a campaign speech but also interesting is that he talked about how foreign policy, and he's done this through his 4 years, foreign policy has to make sense to the common man. It has to make sense to the people. It has to make sense to the domestic audience. And that's been a theme at this UN too, as we think about, how international affairs affects people domestically, and our leaders explaining to them. And I think the most profound part of the speech, he basically said to the autocrats in the room, sometimes we have to give up power. Keeping power is not the most important thing, which is what Biden had just done. But he turned it into a message to the 100 or so non-democracies in the world and said, hey, maybe you could take my example and think about your own desire to cling to power.
All right, Omar, let me come to you and let's address the biggest issue dominating the agenda here at the United Nations General Assembly, the escalating tensions in the Middle East. Now, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called what's happening in the Middle East a nightmare. I wonder, what do you think the UN should do at this point to de-escalate tensions over there? Or in other words, what would you want the UN to do?
Well, we are hearing tough talk from the Secretary General, but we've heard tough talk for the past year, and it hasn't been enough. There is an unfolding genocide happening in the Gaza Strip. We're seeing the spillover in the region. Action is desperately needed to protect people, civilians that are coming under harm's way, that are being killed in the hundreds and thousands. And so, a lot more needs to be done. We heard some talk from some of the speakers yesterday, including President Erdogan, King Abdullah of Jordan, saying maybe an international protection mechanism needs to be assembled to protect the people in Gaza. But the UN's own schools, where its flag is flying, are being bombed, with people sheltering, civilians sheltering there and being killed. Its workers are being killed, UNRWA workers are being killed. And so a lot of action is needed at this time, and what we're only hearing is talk, and that's falling very short. The UN, I think, is failing this moment, this test, and that is why we're also in an inflection point, because there's a crisis within the international system itself, and we've heard many of the leaders address that issue, that there needs to be some type of reform. Secondly, when we're dealing with the Israelis, who seem immune to tough talk, I think we need to look beyond just the action of the moment and think about the impunity that has been allowed to exist for so long, that's leading them to just flaunt international law at every turn. And so I think the international community needs to rally around challenging that impunity by raising the cost on Israel.
To that point about reforms, I think it was the first time we heard U.S. President Joe Biden say that America supports reforms within the United Nations. So do you think that is going to change the dynamics and that brings us closer to having reforms within the United Nations? Because, see, the Turkish president has been saying that the world is bigger than five since 2014. Antonio Guterres also agrees with the Turkish president. He also said that, yes, we need reforms within the United Nations, and now you have the American president supporting that. So do you think we are closer to reforms than ever before?
I would hope so. You know, powerful countries with a kind of a unique type of power, which is the veto power, have a hard time giving that up, traditionally speaking. So, you know, I think there are other U.S. presidents that have called for reform, but, you know, about gutting the UN and its institutions. So we'll see what that means. But I think, you know, if the president is saying it, and depending on who the next president of the United States is, because it certainly won't be Biden, if there is some initiative behind that to make some desperate reforms within the UN, I think it would be welcome.
Kadir, let's just continue with the idea of reform. So a precursor to the General Assembly was this Summit of the Future, and that was aimed at really rethinking the whole UN system, and we thought we had that pretty much done as a deal, and then Russia comes in at the last minute and tries to shoehorn in a last-minute amendment. Does that in and of itself prove the innate dysfunction of the UN, that even when you're trying to address the systemic problems, you can't, basically, because of the nature of the makeup?
Look, the reality is the UN is composed of, you know, 200 countries with different interests, with 5 of them holding veto power over any kind of significant decision. And this has been the case for a long time. When you look at actual major UN action, sanctions, interventions that came out of the UN Security Council, it was always pushed for one of the big powers and negotiated among them. Without that, the frameworks themselves are not sufficient. If we enlarge the UN Security Council, increase the members from 5 to 10, but if they still hold veto powers, it's not going to make much of a difference, because they will, you know, see to it that their narrow national interests are being served on whatever decision has to be made. So I think international law, you know, is there. We have the UN Charter, we have many agreements, and then we have strong frameworks in, you know, protection of civilians, in non-intervention, a number of many things. But when the big powers, the global powers like the United States and Russia and China, if they don't want to do something, then it doesn't happen. So that structure needs to change, and the power relationship between the big powers will always have a role in that. So the only way, in my opinion, to truly reform it, to remove the veto powers from the you know, UN Security Council members, or they should be able to overcome it through a majority vote or supermajority vote in the General Assembly. So they have to think more, you know, creatively about this structure. Otherwise, it's going to be just a repeat of what has happened in the past. There would be a crisis. There would be a need to intervene. Over.
That was his car. It just passed.
President Biden has just driven past.
Very meaningful moment for us to talk about the U.S. power, right? So, you know, when the U.S. wanted to impose sanctions on Iran, they went to Russia, they went to China, negotiated something. North Korea, the same thing. Or intervention in Iraq. So that dynamic today, like Omar mentioned earlier, if the U.S. does not want any pressure on Israel, there's not much the UN can do under this current structure and power relationships we have.
Okay, now talking about Joe Biden, we just saw him. All right, let me ask you a question about him. This was his 4th time addressing the United Nations General Assembly, and the first time he spoke about reforms within the UN. Why didn't he speak about reforms last year, the year before last year, and the first time he addressed the UNGA? Is it because he knows he's leaving and you know what? It's about time to do the right thing.
There's always the chance of lame duck sentiments. But I think the way these speeches come together have less to do often with what's being left out, but what's being put in. They have a limited time, and they actually started using the time limits for the Summit for the Future, which are rarely used, and it was just what he wanted to emphasize. So I think that had more to do with it. But in terms of reform, I agreed with everything my colleague said, but let me add that it's not going to happen anytime soon. And to address the problems that what needs to be reformed aren't addressing, we have workarounds. And I'll give an example, and notwithstanding that I agree with everything my colleague here said about what's going on in the Middle East, the United Arab Emirates showed us a few months ago that you can get the U.S. to abstain in certain circumstances on the ceasefire, and there was two other resolutions on the Security Council where the U.S. abstained, and they weren't so weak they were meaningless. They were actually meaningful resolutions. On many other cases, I've seen the Russians abstain when they really didn't want to, but there was some log rolling, some horse trading that went on in the UN. So unfortunately, until we get proper reform, which addresses, I love this idea of maybe an 80% or a 66% supermajority of the UN can overrule a veto in the Security Council. Until we get to that point, it's going to take the big powers negotiating with each other, and that works sometimes. Sometimes we get what we need, notwithstanding that it's a disaster on the Israeli account right now. But I mean, isn't it sort of ironic right now, in a negative sense, that it's the U.S. backing Israel with the veto, and Russia dominating Ukraine with the veto, and the UN would have done a lot more on both of those conflicts if those two countries hadn't been wielding their vetoes in ways that were unhelpful.
We are expecting Netanyahu to speak here on Friday. How do you think that's going to go down?
Well, he's spoken in front of the United Nations General Assembly many times before. He, is very theatrical. He's often divorced from reality. He's an excellent propagandist for his country and their policies, which are often, again, devoid from reality. But I don't think many people are buying what Netanyahu has to say. That's in his own country as well as here at the United Nations and around the world. He's trying to sell a war that people see on their phones every day is the maybe worst atrocity we've seen in generations taking place against a captive population in the Gaza Strip. People seeing what's happening in Lebanon and the escalation that was initiated by the Israelis. And so, I think Netanyahu is going to be standing alone.
And those speeches are one thing, but we know there are lots of bilateral meetings behind closed doors. Do you think that there will be much pressure applied to him?
I think, it's fortunate that the UNGA is happening at this moment in which this escalation happened in Lebanon, because at least you have leaders from all over the world convening, and you have those conversations that are happening on the side. And hopefully people see what's at stake here. Leaders see what's at stake, and I think they do know what's at stake for the region and the globe. And they are not only talking to Netanyahu, but also talking to Biden, talking to the Americans and people that have leverage over Netanyahu and the Israelis, and will finally compel them to exercise that leverage in order to bring a ceasefire to Gaza, which will hopefully de-escalate the broader conflict.
Okay, so since we're talking about Netanyahu, let me bring in the issue of Gaza, certainly an issue that is dominating the agenda at the United Nations General Assembly, and Netanyahu is the perpetrator of the onslaught on Gaza right now. Kadir, I listened to President Erdogan's speech yesterday. And certainly it's not the first time the Turkish president has raised the plight of the Palestinian people at this very place. This was his 14th time addressing the General Assembly. In the past, in 2019, for example, he held a map of Palestine, highlighting how Israel has been occupying more and more Palestinian territories. But this time around, what really stood out for me was the fact that the Turkish president spoke about Gaza alone, for almost 20 minutes. So he dedicated more than half of his speech to the plight of the Palestinian people. I know the answer to this question is obvious, but I want you to remind our audience why.
Well, it's obvious, but it's not always obvious, like you said. People don't necessarily understand. We get asked this question a lot. Why does Turkey care so much? There's several answers to that. One is Turkey has always been pro-Palestinian. It's regardless of which party is in power, despite the fact that Turkey was one of the first countries to recognize Israel as a state at its foundation. It's important for Turkish domestic audiences, domestic policy, because Turkish citizens themselves care about this issue. We can discuss why. That's a long story. The second thing is, this conflict has been causing a lot of destabilization in the region for a very long time. And when you have instability in the region, you can't do business, you can't prosper, and at every relationship you have, Turkey, Turkish leadership, when they go to Cairo, when they go to Tehran, when they go to, Riyadh, this issue is there, even if that's not the hot issue that day, but it's always going to be affecting regional affairs. And then the third part is, I think, why President Erdogan spent so much time on this is the fact that United Nations is failing on this score, and this is the ultimate example of a conflict that the UN is supposed to do something about. When it keeps failing so repeatedly, so systematically, it becomes even more relevant to talk about it at this forum. And I think that's what President Erdogan tried to do. So both at the national level, regional level, and global level, the conflict has a lot to say to the world opinion, has a lot of meaning in terms of the earlier power relationships we talked about. I just want to add one thing about the earlier question. The President Biden's timing about the reform was actually triggered, in my opinion, by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Prior to that, U.S. would not even talk about it all that much. And then what's happening right now is both Russia and China haven't sent their leaders here, and the negotiations you're talking about, give and take, it's not happening at a meaningful level that could actually prevent the conflict or do something about it anytime soon. So, yeah, I just wanted to mention those two things.
Okay, well, we're very happy to report that we are joined now by Nancy O'Kale, who has made it through the barriers. Well done, Nancy. We've just been talking about, we started off by talking about Joe Biden and his last address to the UN, saying that we're at an inflection point when it comes to global affairs. What's your view on that?
Well, basically what we're seeing is more of the same with what we have been seeing over the past year, and people are surprised that we are 1 year into the war in Gaza, for example, but it's not really surprising because all the way it was only a slight change in messaging and rhetoric, and as we are hearing from President Biden over and again, without any action. And even when the signals that Biden is changed the rhetoric, saying that he would not accept what's happening and it's inhumane what's happening to the Gazan people and there must be a ceasefire, but there's no or else. I mean, because there are no consequences and there is no enforcement of not just the international humanitarian law, there's no enforcement of the U.S. law, because by U.S. laws, the current, glaring evidence of human rights violations and it's like the crimes that are being committed in Gaza are so glaring, committed and recorded by credible organizations. Yet, we have not been able to see a real movement towards conditioning aid or suspending arms, even in order to have a fair and credible assessment of the situation. So why would Netanyahu stop right now? Because there are no consequences in the war.
To that point, do you think the U.S. needs to do more?
Absolutely. It hasn't done anything.
What's stopping the U.S. from doing more?
I'm sorry?
What's stopping the U.S. from doing more to stop Israel?
Well, there are some ideological positioning from the president himself. There are also some wrong calculus and assumptions. One of the false assumptions that they have that, first of all, if they do something that is with consequences to Israel, that's going to affect the politics and elections in the U.S. Whereas at the same time, I mean, with all the protests that we've seen in the U.S. in support of Palestine was not taken into the calculus because they think Americans don't vote on foreign policy. But again, like it's been proven over and again that people don't perceive Gaza as a foreign policy issue. They perceive it as a rights and values issue that is universal, that is beyond an issue that is just happening in the Middle East out there. So why else he's not doing any more? I mean, he also has been just giving the bear hug to Netanyahu since day one, and he has not moved an inch, even though he's saying that Netanyahu is acting, I would say, against the interests of the Israelis and against the interests of the hostages' return. I mean, I'm sure you all see the protests of the families of the hostages who are not happy with what's happening right now.
The US role is hard to define at the moment. We're obviously waiting for an election. It's certainly what most people in America are talking about. I'm always very interested in the conversations, William, behind closed doors here at the UN General Assembly. How much conversation will there be about the upcoming US election and what a Trump future looks like? We know he doesn't like these multilateral institutions, and what a Harris presidency might look like for the rest of the world.
So as you intimated in your question and previously, the most important meetings, I think, at the United Nations don't happen in that building. Right. They're happening in hotels all around the city. I'm going to one tonight with VVIPs, like a bunch of foreign ministers getting together. You know, there's a lot of outside discussions and outside activity, which lends itself to the formal discussions, you know, at some point, and may adjust what's being discussed publicly, but the private discussions are huge. Also, all the classified stuff. I'm a former diplomat, and all the stuff about warfare and nuclear issues and, you know, misinformation, disinformation, espionage, a lot of that is being discussed in the hotels too. And
you'll never hear about
it. You'll hear about it, you'll read about it in books, you know, but that's all going on at the UN. But if I could also add something to what my colleague said on the U.S. position on and politics on Israel. You know, my whole life, Israel-Palestine was called the third rail of U.S. politics, and politicians didn't want to touch it. Most politicians still don't. And so when I think about the stubbornness and immobility in the U.S. positions, I'm looking at people my age just behaving the way they've always behaved about the issue and trying to push it away. And so I would say it's an issue of political culture of the United States, which is pro-Israel going back decades, and the massive success of the Israeli lobby to do things like criminalize speech against Israel. In my state of Maryland, you can't get a federal loan if you've said something against Israel. You know, and so those are massive problems. Now the hope, and there's some hope we could look at, and that was touched at in my colleagues' answers, is that right now the Republicans are still in that mode I'm talking about, but the Democrats are split. Okay. And that's why Kamala Harris is sort of talking both ways, and Biden is talking both ways. But we're starting to see the change in the U.S. policy, and it may not be in weeks, it may not be in months, but in the coming close years, I think the Democratic Party in particular and independent American voters are going to react against the Israeli lobby, are going to change the U.S. opinion. Already under 30s, Americans under 30 are that way.
Public opinion and the protests that we've seen, are they having an impact?
Yeah, even young Jewish people are now pretty much almost majority pro-Palestinian in this city. So the change has started. It won't be enough to do what my colleagues want done immediately, but we're seeing generational change, which will be very impactful on this issue. In terms of the short-term thing, we're just going to have to, getting back to what my colleague was saying, convince the policymakers that it's in their interest to do the right thing, and that's the tough slog that we've been talking about before we have that generational change happen.
Right, and I think it's in their interest to talk about a just, fairer world, right? And this is what we heard from the president's speech, Kadir, yesterday as well. He has been advocating for a multipolar world, challenging Western dominance with countries like China on the rise, and of course then you have India with one of the biggest populations in the world. Do you think it's likely that American politicians, and with the help of such meetings, we are heading towards a just and a fairer world?
No.
No?
The short answer, is that. But you know, American politics is beholden to certain dynamics, just like any national, you know, politics. This time around, like my colleague said, a lot of politicians don't want to touch it, but a lot of politicians have come down heavily on the side of Israel by passing so many, you know, legislation providing funding specifically to bombs that are being dropped on Gaza. So there is no actually like hesitation on the part of the US politicians, a lot of them, most of them I would say, because it's a safe bet to be on the side of Israel, Israel's security, etc. But of course, you know, the world is seeing a different thing happening, a war that is, you know, imposed upon children and, you know, civilians, etc. So we know all of that, but US politics will change, I agree, over time. The current generation is different. But on top of all of that, I think President Biden made a very conscious decision, partly like what Nancy said, it's an ideological choice on the part of the US president to support, give Netanyahu a bear hug. This is a figure who has troubled US presidents for 4 decades through his policies that were simply aimed at deepening, enlarging the occupation. And he's never been interested in peace. And we have always pretended that there was a peace process, but Biden made a decision to give him whatever he needed with the justification that he was fighting against terrorism. And this is a people under occupation. So when you look at all this picture, it's hard to say we are moving towards
talking about Israel and the US in particular, see historically, I mean, I think there's consensus among many experts that the US has a lot of influence over Israel. If President Biden calls Netanyahu right now and say, you know what, you got to end the war in Gaza right now, I mean, if we listen to those experts, it should happen. But the problem is it's not happening. Is that perhaps an indication that the U.S. has lost its influence over Israel?
No, that's why I brought up Biden, because he made that decision. He has put supposedly red lines, right? He said to Netanyahu, I don't want you to go into Rafah. Israeli army is in Rafah. They're going slowly, but they are in there. So when there's no punishment or accountability for violating U.S. red lines, of course, these kind of leaders will cross that line, and they can use their influence in U.S. Congress to sort of play the politics to their advantage. The U.S. presidents have that power, but they refuse to do it, sometimes for ideological reasons, sometimes for electioneering, sometimes for other reasons, but at the end of the day, we haven't seen a U.S. president who is willing to say, okay, we need to put an end to this conflict for once and for all. And we can't also ignore the fact that U.S. is complicit in this. It is providing funding, arms, whatever Tel Aviv needs. There was a hesitation at some point that, you know, they wanted to put some pressure so that, you know, maybe public opinion in the world would not go, you know, out of control like that. But then Israel did that operation in Syria, Iran responded, and all of a sudden U.S. Congress said, forget about, you know, you can't even imagine holding the arms to Israel. You have to actually give him more funding and more arms.
Omer, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, just really quick. I think there's a difference between leverage and influence. The United States has a lot of leverage over Israel, but it needs to translate that by cost. It can't just call Netanyahu on the phone and say, stop this war. It says, stop this war or else, as Nancy said. And it's unwilling to do that because Israel also has leverage over the United States, which it exercises through the pro-Israel lobby in the United States and its influence over politics. And so it becomes very difficult for the United States to translate that leverage, which it has through, you know, all the support that it gives Israel, into the type of influence that would cause it to stop. And that's how this dynamic works.
Yeah, fascinating. Interesting.
And just this idea of reform, Nancy, we've touched on it, but it seems to be a consensus now that reform is necessary for the UN to have any kind of impact. But is it realistic at all to think that it is on even the far horizon? Meaningful reform?
I I think it is. I mean, because even if there's no will, they will be forced to do it, and because either it's going to become more and more irrelevant, and I mean, just like a nice building out there that people just gather in, or they will need to just respond to all the calls for the reform to have a real impact and change. I mean, like they need structural changes. I mean, and I think it was promising to hear all the people and leaders speaking of expanding the UN Security Council. I mean, beyond just like the few powerful countries.
Right, but how do you do that when you have permanent members who really don't want to do that?
I think those permanent members are also affected by their own people. And we've seen, for example, like countries like who are very hardliners in support of Israel at the beginning of the war, like Germany, for example, they have slowly changed their position, not to the best extent, but that's because of the protests and the demands of the people in their country. The same thing happening like all over the world, and we're seeing change. I mean, at the beginning when the ICJ case was put forward, people were mocking it, so it's like dismissive of it, and all of a sudden it's been taken seriously. All of a sudden people are resorting to use actually the international institutions and have them have a different say to that. Yes, it doesn't have an actual impact or a mechanism for implementation, but it means a lot that to see the world is like going into one direction where just few others are going in one direction. It may stay for another decade. I mean, I'm not super optimistic seeing what we are facing right now, because the failure we're seeing, we failed not just the Palestinians, we failed our humanity. And this is something that, at least, I mean, as my colleagues said, like the younger generations are not accepting it. And there will be a point that they will have to make that change.
I just want to ask you briefly, we spoke to the younger generation last week, didn't we? And we were speaking to students here from New York about their faith or lack of in the UN, and I'm interested in all of your perspectives on that, as to whether you have faith in this institution. We're surrounded by the world's media, the world's leaders. We put so much importance on this event, but do you, Nancy, to start off with you, if you can all answer briefly, do you have faith in the United Nations?
I don't. As it is right now, without reform.
Okay.
I agree. No, I mean, the UN is structurally weak, and so it needs countries with will in order to act. And at the moment, there's too much opposition to the kind of political will needed to solve problems.
William?
I disagree, but I'll explain why. I took my pass and I went to all 39 floors and visited a lot of people I knew and looked at a lot of things going on, and I'm just amazed by how much the UN does and how many issues they're doing. And getting back to the just world question, I think that relates, because I disagreed on that a little bit too. Some things are getting much worse, like the number of displaced people in the world, food insecurity, the climate issue, and I could list, you know, the 56 things the Summit of the Future needs to address. And there are crises, there are serious issues, but some things are getting significantly better. Global health is getting better. Global education is getting better. A lot of it's out of this building. You know, incomes are up. And it's amazing to me as I go to different UN agencies, also in Europe, UNESCO, and the different the Human Rights Organization in Geneva, the number of issues they're making progress on are in the thousands every year. And so I have a lot of faith ultimately in what Guterres organized the Summit of the Future for, which is multilateral solutions to problems rather than national level solutions, notwithstanding the ferocity of Gaza, notwithstanding the ferocity of what the Ukrainians are going through. I think those are outliers in this world right now where countries actually want to cooperate more and bring their populations along with them. So I'm a little more glass half full than some of my colleagues, notwithstanding what's in the news.
I would change my answer to a glass half full.
Okay, where's your glass, Kadir?
Yeah.
There's no denying that the UN does a lot of work. That's not the question we were raising earlier, and I don't think it's a matter of faith. It's a matter of understanding what this institution was set up for in the first place, right? And what its function should be, main function. So when it comes to the most critical issues, if it's unable to provide answers, everything else gets looked over. Many good things, right, good people work here. We have friends, colleagues. My relatives worked here before, so I would never say UN is irrelevant. But the problem is, earlier I tried to raise that issue, and there's power structures that actually put a hold on everything, right? To an actual negotiation, actual process where they can come to an agreement. US says no on Israel, and then Russia says no on Ukraine, and China says no on something else, and there's no grounds for negotiating. And because of the politics of these countries now, like I mentioned earlier, neither Putin or Xi are here. UN's leverage and influence are being reduced, and its ability to find solutions are also being reduced on those other issues as well. So the world is not, Gaza is not the only issue in the world. We know that, and UN does a lot. But the sad reality is that when it comes to war and peace, that UN was supposed to act on that. It's failing.
Yeah, actually, since we're at it, just let me put one question to all of you. See, in order for reforms to happen within the United Nations, all 5 UNSC members have to agree, and it's not happening anytime soon. So is it about time the UN should be replaced with a more inclusive and more effective organization or institution, Nancy?
It's not about replacing one organization with another one. It's more about having an equitable structure. The whole point about the United Nations is like the preservation of what we keep on calling like the rules-based world order. And we keep just like praising this, and we're very worried that another president may come and ruin that. But if we look at it, I agree. And yes, the UN does a lot. But there are 2 caveats here. The people who have access to what the UN has to offer, the UN organizations, they don't have equal access. Not the country don't have equal access to it and don't have equal power to it. It's only telling, just again, not to undermine the value of everything they're offering, but there is a UN organization who, UNRWA, its funding has been suspended, their members has been killed, and there are no consequences. This is part of this organization, and they could not do anything about it. It's so telling that you are seeing, and this is something that's just like a humanitarian issue. It's not even just, you cannot just look at it politically. We're talking about people access to medicine, to food, to safety. It's just very difficult to see that this is happening, yet they can't do anything about it. Where is the accountability for, I think over 100 people from UNRWA were killed. I don't want to, I don't know the exact numbers right now, but this is huge. And just also, it tells you it's that level of inability to do something about, an issue that is related to an organization that it's part of it.
Yeah.
I mentioned in my first answer what Nancy just said about, UN employees being killed, UN schools being bombed, and no action being taken. So I think that speaks to it. I agree with her, though, that it's not about replacing the United Nations. I think reform is enough. But in my last answer, I said the United Nations is weak structurally.
But Umar, my point is the reforms are not happening. The problem is they will never agree on reforming.
If reforms aren't going to happen, a replacement of the United Nations is going to happen. Unless there is a catastrophic event.
From the so-called global south, which I like to call the global majority, they should come up with something.
What led from the League of Nations to the United Nations? We had the World War II. So you had a cataclysmic event that needed a different type of institution with more powers vested in it in order to respond to the things. The thing is, the United Nations was designed to be weak because it's a balance between states and their powers and a global international system and its powers. And states weren't willing to vest too much of their own power in that state structure. And a few powers kept the veto power for themselves and the Security Council. So this is the structure of the United Nations. So it can either be a cataclysmic event that leads to something else, or the type of reform that maybe vests more power in the United Nations to do more.
Yeah. I know you both want to respond.
I'll be quick.
Yeah, please.
Leave him some time. But On floor number 5 is the group of 77, which I noticed today is 134, for precisely the reason you just asked it, that there need to be global South structures. But I wouldn't put it outside the UN, I'd put it in. And if you look at the other multilateral and multi-country organizations, like the second largest one's the OIC, you know, what's the OIC done lately? And I could go around to various regional groupings and the blocks, and a lot of them are causing more problems than they're solving. So I strongly agree with what my colleagues said, that you have to reform this place, and there are some things you can do quickly, like Guterres is working on, and some medium term and longer term, and I agree on the longer term solutions on the veto, but I'll
we only have a couple of minutes left, Kadir.
Yeah.
I mean, I just wanted to refer to 9/11 when, you know, I was driving on the street that day, heading back up down, but on 9/11 what the US did was put together a coalition of the willing, and they didn't believe in the UN, they didn't go work through the UN, and they started a practice of putting together different coalitions for different issues. So different things are being done, right? Coalitions against, you know, climate change, coalition against this and that. So UN does not need to be replaced necessarily to serve other functions. We have G20, we have NATO, we have many institutions, international institutions. The problem is the UN with the, you know, Security Council has really big international legal powers that could be used for good, but it's not being used for the reasons that we talked about, the veto power and the power relationships. So it's not a question of replacing UN, but making it better, but in a much more intelligent way. We really have to get rid of or diminish the power of the veto power.
And I'm glad we got consensus on one thing, that the UN should not be replaced. Unfortunately, we are out of time. It's
really,
such a fascinating discussion,
really,
and of course it requires
Thank you all so
a longer
much.
debate. Kadir, William, Omar, and Nancy, thanks very much for joining us
Thank you for your time.
here in the UN headquarters. I'm Jafar Hasnan.
I'm Amanda Walker. Thanks for joining us.